Hi everybody, and welcome to the second video in DTEI's Summer 2022 Course Design Certificate Program Asynchronous Video Series. So in this video, we're going to cover the following concepts. So we're going to start with a framework called the IPD framework for Introduce, Practice, and Demonstrate. And this is a framework that allows you to go from your course goals to figuring out how to lay out the schedule for your course. So we'll start there, and then we'll sort of zoom into the lesson level, so the day-to-day level. We'll talk about active learning, why you might incorporate active learning, and what kinds of examples we have for active learning exercises. And then we'll talk about lesson planning. So how to go from scheduling the course down to the individual lesson and what to incorporate in your individual lesson is sort of the trajectory for this video. So let's get started with the IPD framework. So here's the idea. First, you want to introduce a concept or some kind of knowledge or skill to a student. You give them an introduction to this concept, and that's their first encounter. Next, you want to give them some time to practice using that concept or skill, and you want this to be really low stakes. So the practice that students are doing shouldn't be like a high stakes assessment. It should be sort of the day-to-day practice of using it in the classroom, using it in a discussion section, using it for homework, etc. And then finally, you want them to demonstrate that they've acquired the knowledge or can use the skill that you're asking them to use. So you want to give them an opportunity to demonstrate their understanding. So that's introduce, practice, and then finally demonstrate. And throughout the process, remember that this is all student-centered. The student's first encounter, their opportunity to practice, and their opportunity to demonstrate. You're always asking, what are the students doing? So that's the big overview. Let's zoom into the pieces. So we'll start with introduce. Introduce, the question you might have is, how do we effectively introduce students to a new topic or skill that we want them to learn? So I'll give you some sort of background considerations when you're thinking about this question. So you want to first consider, what is it that I expect them to know before I ask them to engage with this new topic or skill? They always have this prior knowledge, and so figuring out what your expectations for their prior knowledge are is really important to getting them to acquire this new knowledge or skill. The second question is, well, along these lines, where would they have been introduced and when would they have been given the opportunity to practice that prior knowledge? Now, I think these are like especially important questions post-pandemic or in the midst of sort of a pandemic that's slowly going away, because you might have expectations that students have some knowledge or skill that they would have developed in a previous class, but that class, it might have had pandemic-related difficulties. And so you want to be really careful with what you're assuming that students have. And if there's ways that you can give them assignments, additional assignments or something like that, or additional office hours to help them get up to speed with some of that background knowledge, it might be really useful. Okay, and then finally, a sort of similar question is, based on this prior knowledge, what level of Bloom's taxonomy should you pitch this new topic at? So if they have background, like baseline factual knowledge, you can move to a higher level. But maybe they don't even have that, and so you'll stick to a lower level of Bloom's taxonomy when you're introducing this new concept or skill. So let me give you some ideas for how to introduce students to these new topics. So I'll split them into like lecture-y ideas or ideas that you can implement in the classroom, and then reading-centered ideas that they might implement either when they're reading in the classroom or when they're more likely reading outside of the classroom. So in lecture, you can have interactive or incomplete PowerPoints. So interactive PowerPoints would be like if you introduce poll questions into the PowerPoint, and we can talk about different softwares that you might use to do this if you want during the synchronous session. incomplete PowerPoint. Some people like to do this. They'll print out or give students a copy of the slides, and then there'll be blanks in the slides, and then the students have to fill it in as they go or as you present the PowerPoint. So they're filling in the blanks that are missing. Be careful with this so it just doesn't so it doesn't become just like a copy down the relevant word game, because I don't think students learn very much with that. But there's ways of doing this where they can really put what you're saying into their own words and add that information in. Active learning, we'll talk about that in just a minute, but that would be another kind of lecture-y idea. Reflective learning, this would be like if students were being asked to do reflections after the lectures, some of the stuff that we're actually doing or having you do in the synchronous sessions, it would be an example of this kind of reflective learning. And dynamic lecturing is sort of if you were to incorporate the interactive PowerPoints and active learning into the lecturing, that may be a way of presenting new information to students. Okay, and then the second set of ideas are reading related. So if the course you're teaching has a lot of reading in it, here are some ways that you can make that a little bit more interactive to introduce new topics. So focus question or worksheets would be one example. So you can design these worksheets to get students to think about like what kinds of concepts you want them to focus on from the reading. Guided note-taking kind of similarly, but you introduce a little bit more structure that reflects the structure of what they're reading. So it's like an outline or something like that, and they're filling it in as they go. Conceptual maps might be another good idea. So you ask them to map the different parts of whatever reading they're doing. Another idea that's not on here that I was recently introduced to is for students to look at each of the section titles before they start reading anything at all. So you give them a reading and you say, the way I want you to read this is first make an outline just based on the section headings. Then think about what kinds of questions you expect to be answered in each of these question headings. Then read it and see if actually your expectations were met or what kinds of questions you might still have. I think that's, so the way that is presented, this is typically done as like a better way of reading, but I think it also gets students thinking a little bit more about what kinds of questions they might have. And so the discussions that you might have that are based on student questions might be much improved if you adopt that kind of reading strategy for students. Okay, so that's the introduce. What about the practice? So here the question is, how can our students practice using the skills and content that we want them to learn? So some important considerations here. What will the students be doing? Like, what do you want them to do in order to practice? And it's important here that they actually are doing something, because otherwise they cannot be practicing, right? You might think about like, what is the classroom setting like? Are they practicing individually? Are they practicing in groups, etc.? And then also think like, what other activities have you done or plan to do? I find that asking students to do things that you haven't been doing throughout the whole quarter is a little trickier. And what I mean by that is like, if you've been doing a certain kind of activity all quarter and you suddenly ask them to change it up, they're a lot more resistant to that than if you continue doing the same kinds of activities or from the start do a variety of activities. They're much more likely to respond positively. And so just think about what kinds of activities have you done so far and how far is what you're asking them to do now from what they've done in the past. And then finally, the demonstrate. So how can our students demonstrate the skills and content that we want them to learn? Questions here include how will the assessment reflect what you introduced to them and then what they practiced. Make sure that the style and level are the same. So the style meaning like, is it a group assessment? Have they been doing group activities? And level meaning like, are you at the same level of Bloom's taxonomy in the assessment or as you were in the introduce and practice steps? At the same level or lower is what I would say what makes for a good assessment. If you ask them to suddenly create something when they haven't been creating anything all quarter, that might not go as well. Okay, and then don't have students do something for a grade that they've never seen before. And that includes skills, that includes the style of the activity, and that includes the Bloom's taxonomy level. So as I said before, if you ask them to create something if they've never created, that'll be difficult. If you ask them to do something in groups that they've only done individual work, that'll be difficult. And if you ask them to do something of a totally different style, like you want them to write a paper, but they've only ever taken Scantron exams, that will also be difficult. And as I just said, assess at the same level or below that you teach. Okay, so we just went through the introduce, practice, demonstrate framework. Now, let's talk about where to even start using this framework. So the way I use this framework is in structuring how to schedule the course with respect to the course goals. So start with your course goals, look back at them and see which of these relies on the other and in what order I want students to meet these course goals. Now, some of them might be that you want like the whole quarter you want to work on some course goal, that's totally fine. But certainly you'll have some other ones where you say, okay, they can do this in 3 weeks, they can do this in 4 weeks. And so what the goal here is that for each of your objectives, your course goals, you have some weeks where you're introducing it, some weeks when they're practicing it, and then some weeks when they're demonstrating. And these can obviously overlap. So if you have 2 weeks where you want to introduce objective 1 or course goal 1, but in that second week, you also want them to practice. They're going to continue practicing for another week. But in week 3, you're also going to introduce objective 2. That's because they're practicing, which could be like outside of classwork, but you want to introduce a new concept during class. And then you want to assess them, but you also want to give them some homework in week 4 or something like that. So they're demonstrating the first course goal, but they're also practicing the second one at the same time. So you can overlay the IPD parts of each of your course goals as you wish, but just make sure that for each goal, there's time when they're introduced to it, time when they practice it, and time when they're demonstrating it. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like on one of my syllabi. In the schedule section, I have it split by week. So each of these rows is a different week. So in week 1, I have that we're discussing SLO 1 and 2. In week 2, I have that we're discussing SLO 2. And so that likely means that they've been, that they demonstrated their understanding of SLO 1, and now they're practicing SLO 2 and demonstrating it as well. Weeks 3 and 4, we do an introduce and practice of SLO 3, etc., etc. So you totally don't have to put this on your syllabus. You don't have to show which SLO is being met at which week, but I think that it's a really good practice to have in the background as you're designing the course, and it sort of structures the flow of the course. Okay, so that's the IPD framework. Now, this naturally leads us to talk about lesson planning, and the idea here is like, if you continue zooming in to one of the levels, introduce, the practice, or demonstrate, you'll sort of figure out how to structure the lesson based on what step you're at and what you want students to be doing at that step, right? So we'll get there in just a minute, but before we get to lesson planning, let me introduce active learning so that you can incorporate some of these activities into the lesson planning itself. So let's start with active learning next. First, let me give you a really rough definition. Active learning is anything that students are doing in the classroom. Basically, active learning is anything besides passive listening. It can include anything from just note-taking about a lecture to doing a collaborative group assignment. But the idea is that any instructional method that engages students in the learning process is a form of active learning. Now let's talk about why you might use active learning before I give you some examples. So I'll motivate it a little bit before I give you examples. There's been tons of studies about active learning and the effects of active learning for different students. This is a really famous meta-analysis by Freeman et al. And I'll just give you some of the highlights of what they find. So they meta-analyzed 225 studies, as in they looked at the results of 225 studies, and they found that on average, student performance on exams and concept inventories increased when active learning was used. In STEM fields, they find that the overall failure rate of students decreases when you use active learning. So that's that right plot there. And you can see that it's a percentage decrease in failure rate, and all of it is above 0, meaning that for every course, less students failed when active learning was implemented. So another form of active learning is a sort of cooperative learning, or students learning together. And so I'll also give you some stats from a paper on cooperative learning. They say that cooperative learning promoted higher individual achievement than competitive or individualistic learning. And these results held across verbal, mathematical, and procedural tasks. It also promoted metacognitive thought, which is this thinking about your thinking. And so students that exhibit metacognition tend to do much stronger metacognition, tend to do much better in their courses. Overall, here's the takeaways from a lot of literature about active learning. There's better retention of the course material. Here, what I mean is that students remember the course material better, like with more detail and for longer. So if you ask them 5 years later, they're more likely to remember the course material if you used active learning in the course than if you didn't. Importantly, it's been shown in this active learning literature that students from marginalized or disadvantaged backgrounds in the fields of study often do much better, have a stronger advantage by using active learning than through traditional lecture. There are fewer lapses in student attention throughout the lecture when you're using active learning, as in they're more likely to be attuned to what you're saying or what they're doing the whole time, as opposed to spacing out throughout the lecture. And then also it makes teaching and learning engaging and fun. Okay, so I've talked to you a lot about why you might use active learning. What are some strategies you might adopt? Here are some that I'll just go through very quickly, and I'm happy to talk about more in the synchronous session. You might do a think, pair, share. So the idea here is you pose a question, you have students think about it for a little bit individually, they reflect on it, then they pair up with their neighbor, and then they share with the class what their thoughts are on that question. A note, compare, share, very similar. Students reflect on their note-taking skills with a partner and then with the group. And they can do that outside of class too. So if you want to do collaborative note-taking, you can do that. Okay, jigsaw, this is one of my favorite ones. So you split students into group, and each group becomes an expert about or at something. You then mix up the groups, so the new groups have one member of each of the former groups. So the new group has a diversity of expertise. Each student now presents to their new group what they learned in their previous group. So everybody learns about all of the different topics, and every student gets to present back to the new groups. After you do this, I would really strongly recommend doing a debrief and saying, okay, what were the main takeaways from each of the subgroups? But I think that students respond really well, and it's really nice to see them presenting to one another, and it's a great way to have everybody in the class engaged. Okay, another one, concept mapping. This is, as it sounds, you map the connections between terms and concepts. You can do this in small groups. You can also do it as a large group. So in small group, have each group put up the concept map on the board maybe. As a large group, you can do it yourself and have students say what concepts they want connected, or elect somebody to be your note taker on the board, and you can step back and guide conversation. You might also have different role play methods where students create hypothetical scenarios or take on the roles of hypothetical characters, or real scenarios if there are kind of scenarios that they can enact from the course material. You could do a 1-minute paper. This one we'll use in synchronous sessions. Basically, students have 1 minute to respond to some open-ended question or some time to reflect, and they write continuously for 1 minute. You could do muddiest or clearest point, and this gets you really quick feedback about the muddiest or the least clear and the clearest points of the lecture. And it forces students to reflect back on the lecture material and figure out, okay, what did I not understand? Why didn't I understand that? What can we do differently? Okay, so this was an overview of a bunch of different active learning activities that you can do, I would say that a lot of this falls both into the introduce and into the practice part of the IPD framework. Now, as you're thinking about lesson planning, I want you to think, okay, how can I incorporate some of these ideas into my lesson planning? And then how can I make sure to follow this IPD framework as I'm doing that? So I'm just going to go through a template lesson plan, and I'll go through each of the sections of the lesson plan, and then you sort of stitch those all together into a complete cohesive lesson plan. But there's lots of different ways that people do lesson planning, and we can talk more about this in the synchronous session as well. So a lesson plan, I think the best one starts with some kind of learning outcomes. Importantly, these are not your course level learning outcomes. They're not your course goals. These are your lesson level ones. These are much more specific and narrow. So by the end of this lesson or by the end of this class period, students will be able to blah, blah, blah. The template looks the same, but the scope is much narrower. And you can see that because the second question asks, by what activity or activities will they achieve each outcome? Whereas on the course goal level, you're really asking for student understanding or students to be able to do something, but you don't need them to demonstrate it yet or to practice it yet. At the lesson level, you really want to give them the opportunities to practice. So that's the first section. Then you might think about, based on the activities I want to do, what supplies will I need and what quantities, what kinds of items, what room configuration will I need? Do I need small groups? Do I need a larger group or a large circle? What kinds of room configurations do I want to adopt? And then preparation just in terms of what needs to be done in advance by you or by the students. So if you need to print out some worksheets or something, that would be in that section. Typically, then you would have some kind of schedule. So you would say, okay, from 9 to 9:30, we're going to do activity 1 for 30 minutes. And you would just list out or block out the times for your lesson like that. Now, I think a lot of you have either TA'd or been instructors of record yourself, and so you're familiar with lesson planning, but what I'm doing here is introducing you to how to think about lesson planning once you're in the IPD framework. So hopefully you can start to think about how to synthesize these ideas that we've been presenting in the course design workshop into the lesson plan itself. And then finally, the contingency plans. So if you have extra time, what will you have students do? And if you don't have enough time, what can you cut? Okay, so that's it. So in summary, we talked about the IPD framework, then we talked about active learning, and then we talked about maybe how you can incorporate these active learning ideas into your lesson plans and how your lesson plan fits with your overall course goals in terms of introducing, practicing, and developing the course level objectives that you have for students.